Today, we're talking planning, we're talking costs, and we're talking about some of the things that I did to make my transition from living on land to living on cruise ships as a passenger significantly more achievable and much more straightforward. Welcome to episode 5 of my 7-part YouTube video series, where I'm sharing with you what it was like for me to cruise long term as a passenger on ships all around the world. If you've just found me for the first time today, then I recently completed a 10-month window at sea, where I boarded my first cruise ship over in Dubai, and then basically cruised back to back on loads of different ships from loads of different cruise lines for a 10-month window. So in this series, I'm sharing all of that with you. Now, this is episode 5, but don't worry if you've just found me today, because you'll find all of the links to all of the other episodes in this series down in the description of this video. Before we jump in today to look at the planning element, the costs element, and also the transition window, let me first of all give you a recap on what we've covered in the previous 4 episodes so far. In episode 1, I covered with you which ships I travelled on and which routes I took as part of my adventure. I then shared with you some of the financial side of things, aka how could I actually afford to do a trip of this nature. Episode 2 was when I then covered the ships in more detail. I shared with you which was my favourite ship, which was my least favourite ship, and also what are some of the learnings that I've picked up about the cruise industry overall after spending such a long time at sea. In episode 3, I then went on to the ships themselves to cover the topic of cruise ship accommodation, in other words, cabins or staterooms. I shared with you my favourite cabin, my least favourite cabin, and also the most unique cabin that I found while out at sea. I also shared with you in that episode some of the things that I do every single time I get to my cruise ship cabin on any cruise to help me enjoy it to the full. Episode 4, which was my last episode, I covered the topic of homesickness. Now, I didn't think I was going to be overly affected by homesickness, but I certainly was at various points throughout the trip. In that video, I shared with you some of the things that I do to minimise the feeling of homesickness, and also what I do to feel better when I do find that hit me while I'm out at sea or while I'm travelling. And that brings us to today, which is episode 5. We're going to cover 3 key topics today. Up first, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I planned my whole 10 months at sea, because that's one of the most frequently asked questions that I get the minute someone finds out that I spent so long out on ships. Second, I'm going to move on to some of the things that you can think about from a cost point of view to keep them as low as possible, because if you don't, then planning a trip like this can really spiral out of control. The third thing that I'm going to cover in this episode today is some of the things that I did to make my transition from living here on land to living on cruise ships as a passenger significantly more simple and way more achievable. So if you are planning a trip like this, make sure that you stay in this video until the end section. Anyway, before we jump into the content of episode 5, if you do enjoy this video today, and if you find it useful, it would be amazing if you would consider supporting my channel by simply clicking the thumbs up button, which you should find directly underneath. I would love to take you on so many more ships going forward as well, so all you have to do is click the subscribe button. It's totally free to do, and it means you can come with me going forward. Anyway, let's get started talking about how I planned my time at sea. First, I had to decide exactly how I wanted to travel. You might look at my YouTube channel and think, well, obviously you knew you were going to travel by cruise ship all along, but that's just not the reality. I sat for weeks on various flight websites, hotel websites, train websites, you name it, I've probably searched for it when I was planning this trip. And when I was evaluating whether or not I should use cruise ships or planes or trains, the one thing that stuck out to me was that planning a trip like this by spending the time on cruise ships was going to be way simpler than any other travel method. If you look at my case, booking a 14-night cruise, that would mean that I would have accommodation covered for 14 nights. I would have food covered for 14 nights, I would have travel covered for 14 nights, and I would have entertainment covered for 14 nights. So actually, when I sat down and weighed up whether I wanted to go on cruises or whether I wanted to go on planes, trains and automobiles, it was a bit of a no-brainer, and that's why I landed on cruising on ships long term. Second, once I figured out that it was cruise ships that I wanted to travel on, I then had to look at a map of the world and figure out exactly where I wanted to travel. This is probably the most important part, because fine, you probably do get some people who just go on a cruise to be on the ship, but I genuinely believe there's so much more to the experience than just seeing the ship. And this to me was a once in a lifetime thing that I probably won't ever get the opportunity to do again. So I wanted to make sure I could tick off as many different experiences in as many different parts of the world as I could during that 10-month window. Now, there were a few things that I really wanted to see. I was dying to see the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. I wanted to cruise out of Miami a number of times. And I also really wanted to take the Queen Mary 2 from New York for a transatlantic. I also wanted to try a transatlantic on a cruise ship, and therefore I was delighted that I could also factor that into the itinerary. Now, one of the main goals for me was that I wanted to use this opportunity to take some cruises that I might struggle to take when I then go back into the, as much as I hate saying it, the real world. So coming from the UK, I tend to take 1 week of holiday from work at a time. That means that if I take 5 business days off, I can usually do a 7-night cruise, because if the ship leaves on a Sunday, then I can do Sunday to Sunday and then sometimes fly overnight and be back in work on the Monday. However, there are some places where that's a bit more difficult and a bit more challenging to do. For example, if I take a 7-night cruise from Barcelona or from Rome, that's absolutely fine to do with 1 week of leave. But if I want to do a 7-night cruise from Long Beach, California or Miami, well, that's suddenly a long haul flight. So I would need to take a few extra days holiday before the cruise and a few days holiday after the cruise to account for delays and so on and so forth, which therefore means it would really eat into my holiday calendar. Also, there's some cruises that I really wanted to do, which would just be so difficult to fit in to a holiday schedule when I came back to the real world. For example, to cruise the Suez Canal, you, typically speaking, need to board a ship in the Middle East, and you need to then leave that ship in Europe, or the other way around. That transit by cruise takes a minimum of 10 nights or 2 weeks. And again, by the time you then factor in flights and travel on both sides, you suddenly can't do that even with 2 weeks off work. The same applies for the Panama Canal. It usually will take a 2-week cruise to start on one side of America, finish on the other, and do the full transit of the canal. So this experience for me was all about deciding which parts of the world I wanted to see, seeing them, and also ticking off some bucket list experiences that I wouldn't be able to do when I went back to the real world. Third, now that I've figured out that I wanted to travel on cruise ships, and I've also figured out which parts of the world I wanted to see, the next question was, which ships did I want to see? Now, the reality is, I wasn't overly fussy when it came to the ships I wanted to see. And when I cruise, I'm generally speaking not overly bothered what ships I go on, as long as it's a new ship for me, because I always like going on a ship I've never been on before, and it's taken me to cool ports. So when I was planning my trip, I just wanted to experience the whole spectrum of ships. So I made a point of making sure that I could get on one of the biggest cruise ships from Royal Caribbean, one of the oldest cruise ships from Royal Caribbean, a Holland America cruise ship, because I'd never done that before, and so many more in between. I also wanted to take a cruise on a Cunard ship. I also wanted to take a transatlantic voyage on Cunard's ocean liner. So there were so many things that I wanted to do that it actually meant my scope was so broad that I could basically pick from just about everything. So I was super flexible in that respect. What did limit me with ships, and it's why I didn't cruise on for example, Icon of the Seas, like the newest Royal Caribbean ship or the newest celebrity ship, I was really limited by solo supplements because I was doing 85 or 90% of my ships solo. And that meant that if I wasn't careful with which ships I booked, I would end up paying an absolute fortune in solo fees. Generally speaking, I found the solo supplements to be way lower on all of my European cruises than what I did when I got to America. I was shocked to see how many ships were operating at full double occupancy solo supplements. It was unbelievable. But yeah, once I figured out which ships didn't have the full solo supplement, and then figured out did it fit into that spectrum of all the different ships I wanted to experience, I was good to go with moving on to the next part of planning. Next, I had to understand what were my non-negotiables through the whole year. In other words, when things would change or if prices didn't align, what were the things that I just simply wasn't willing to not do this year? Now, for me, it was really, really simple. The things that I wasn't willing to negotiate on was seeing the Suez Canal, seeing the Panama Canal, because I wanted to see them both within a year. And I'm glad I did, because the Suez Canal, it's now impossible to get a cruise to there with everything going on. I was also totally non-negotiable about cruising out of Miami, and the other non-negotiable was taking the Queen Mary 2, because that ship has been on my bucket list for years. So yes, that then meant that I could build my itinerary around all of these different factors. So if you're also looking at travelling long term, make sure that you sit down and understand, even write it on a bit of paper, what are all of the non-negotiables that you have for that trip? Because if you understand them, I can guarantee you'll be able to plan a trip that you'll enjoy so much more than if you don't think about that until you embark on the trip. Step number 5. This was the fun bit. It was now time for me to begin shopping. I love holiday shopping, cruise shopping, travel shopping. I could spend weeks doing it and not get bored. So this point of my planning was so enjoyable because I could just come home from work at night, pour a glass of wine and sit down and go on all of the search engines to figure out which ships were where and when. It was so fun. Now, what I also did at this point was I notified my travel agent that this was something that I was planning. I did that for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, I wanted her to be aware of what was coming because I was very aware of the fact that a lot of clients would probably book one cruise at a time. It would be rare, or I thought it would be rare, that she would get a phone call to say, hey, could you book 17 cruises for me, please? Can you do all these price checks? And yeah, I wanted to reassure her that she wasn't about to get a whole list of options that was simply just research and planning, and none of them would end up converting into bookings. So yeah, at that point, I notified my travel agent and just made sure that we had a proper, robust working relationship from that point. And honestly, I would recommend so much, if you are planning to cruise long term, please make sure that you work with a good and reputable travel agent, because if things go wrong further down the line, they can fix it really, really easily. Now, at the same time as notifying my travel agent, I then got started with what I would probably term, or affectionately term, my planning masterpiece, which was a spreadsheet that I put together. Now, throughout my life, I have operated with spreadsheets all the way through. I love them. I love inputting data to a spreadsheet and then figuring out how it all works together. I just love it. So what I did was I found a blank spreadsheet. I had the first column, which was every single day of the year from the point of my travel starting to the point of them planning to finish. I then would block out which ships I was thinking of travelling on over the various windows, and then I would have what ports they were planning to visit. So this spreadsheet, already, you can get the picture. It was pretty full on and pretty intense. Now, as you worked your way across the spreadsheet, it would then cover other things like If you're spending the night on land in between, well, where are you staying? What city will you be in? What are the rough prices of hotels? And then on the topic of prices, on the final column, that's where I would put the costs of everything. And that column ended up being probably the most important, because if you don't track costs when you're planning, suddenly you'll get to the end of your plans, you'll then drag and highlight all the numbers at the side, and you'll suddenly get a bit of a fright because that number at the bottom doesn't match what's in your bank account. And then you think, oh, I'm going to have to cut now to be able to afford this. So all the way through, I charted all of my costs on a spreadsheet on a nightly basis and a by cruise basis, so that I knew at the end exactly how much it would cost, and I could see that figure rising every time I put something in. Now, I'll come back later in this video to talk about some of the things that I did to keep my costs down, and also some of the things that you can do to keep the costs down if you're planning either a similar cruise or a much shorter cruise, but you're keen to keep the budget really tight. Next, I worked to understand exactly what type of cruises I would want to go on throughout my year. Now, I initially, when I started planning, thought it would be way cheaper for me to take ships that would start at point A, finish at point B, start at point B, finish at point C, and take ships that were, generally speaking, always repositioning. Now, that would have been great for me because I didn't then have flights to catch to go to the next place or to go home in between. But what I found was that it was far better for me, especially because I was looking at reducing that solo supplement. It was far better for me to try and position myself in the cities around the world that had huge amounts of cruise ship cabins coming in every day or every week. So the example that I would give you was when I was in Barcelona. Barcelona will have sometimes 5 or 6 big cruise ships coming in every single day. Now that's thousands of cabins that they need to fill on all of the ships. And generally speaking, when you look at a supply and demand model, when you're in a city with loads of cabins to fill, the prices will come down. And it's much more common that you'll be able to get deals on these ships that mean you don't have to spend 2 people's worth of fare to get on board. Now, the same applies if you're looking to cruise from the UK, especially off-peak. Base yourself in Southampton. You'll probably find you'll be able to ship hop much better when there's more ships coming in and out. Now, in my case, I spent about 2 months of my time based out of Barcelona, and that meant on my spreadsheet I could just block out Barcelona for X amount of months and then just fill all of the cruises I wanted to go on in 7 or 14 night increments all the way through. Now, when I was over in the US, I then went through about a 2-month window where I based myself out of Miami. That meant that I could use Miami Cruise Port, I could also use Fort Lauderdale Cruise Port to try and really keep that price as low as possible all the way through. So the trick, try and base yourself in cities around the world where you know there's going to be a lot of cruise ships and therefore a lot of cabins, because in my experience, that's how you avoid being stung for much higher cruise fares, especially if you're cruising solo. Next, I had to think about whether I wanted to cruise back to back or whether I wanted to ship hop. Now, to explain both of them quickly to you before I explain why I went for one of them, if you opt to cruise back to back, that typically means that you'll book a 7-night cruise. You'll then stay on the ship for the next 7-night cruise when all of the passengers from the first cruise go home. You might then find that you book another cruise, so you stay on the same ship again at the end of those 7 nights. Everyone else goes home and you stay on for another 7 nights. Now, to contrast that, ship hopping means the complete opposite, where week 1, you would book a cruise on, for example, Symphony of the Seas from Royal Caribbean. At the end of that week, you then go home, or you leave the ship like everyone else, and you board Costa Toscana, which is one of the cruise ships from Costa Cruises. At the end of that, you then board another cruise ship. At the end of that, you then board another cruise ship, and so on and so forth. Now, you'll already know, if you've followed my channel for a while, that I went for the latter approach, which was to cruise ship hop rather than to cruise back to back. And there were only a very small number of exceptions where I did cruise back to back. Now, there were a few reasons for that. One of them, for me, was that I obviously then wanted to look at growing my YouTube channel and showing as many ships as I could. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I spent 210 nights on the same ship, just going around the world. So for me, that reason alone meant that I really wanted to ship hop. Now, the other reason why it could be better for you to ship hop rather than cruise back to back is that, generally speaking, lots of the cruise ships out there tend to operate on a rotational basis. What that means is that you will quite often find that one cruise ship will operate from what they call a home port, and they will repeatedly offer 7, 14, or sometimes even 21 night itineraries, where if it's on the 7-night rotational loop, every 7 days the itinerary is the same. Now, living on one of those ships, I think it would be very relaxing. I think it would be really calming. It would be a nice experience, but I would get really bored seeing the same places every 7 nights. And that therefore meant for me, there wasn't really too much debate or too much comparison to be doing, because I knew that the best route for me was to ship hop. The next thing that I had to build into my plan was, when I was ship hopping, did I want to hop straight onto a ship as soon as I left the other? Or did I want to try and spend a few days on land in between? Now, for a number of reasons, I opted for the approach of booking a cruise, and at the end of that cruise, I would leave and get a hotel or get an Airbnb or book some kind of accommodation in or close to that city for a couple of days before boarding my next cruise ship. Now, there were a number of reasons for that. First, at the point of me planning my trip, we were unfortunately in the grips of the COVID pandemic. Now, that was back when you needed to have various COVID tests in order to even get on a cruise ship, and I just simply wouldn't have been able to jump from one ship to another repeatedly and reliably, because it would have been so difficult logistically to get tests done in time to then prove a negative result to get on the next ship. Now, thankfully, by the time I started my travels, those requirements were long gone on every single one of my ships, which was such a relief. But what I did realise was that there were other logistical challenges that I had to take into account. For example, laundry. We've already said I tried to keep costs down as much as I could, and in some cases, cruise ship laundry was going to cost me an absolute fortune. Now, rather than getting all of my laundry done on board the ship, I would usually find a laundromat or a laundrette in whatever city I was going to be in, do my laundry there, and get it packed and ready to go on my next ship. In the case of some of my American cruises, for example, I would go to a laundromat in Long Beach, California, and I would spend, say, $4 on my laundry, but then I'd get on the ship and I'd have to pay about $30 if I wanted the same thing. So in my mind, things like that, it was a bit of a no-brainer that I'd want to spend a bit of time on land. Now, if you're planning to cruise long-term, also think about how much will you relax on land versus on the ships. So I knew that I would chill out on land because, to be honest, on ships, I end up running about mad creating content. So I really benefited from a few nights on land. And the final reason was that before doing this trip, I had never spent more than 7 nights on any cruise ship. So I didn't know if I would love it. I didn't know if the motion would go for me. I didn't know what it would feel like. So I decided to spend a few nights on land between almost every ship just to ground myself and to get ready to get back on board. Next, I wanted to minimise flying. I wanted to minimise any flights for a number of reasons. First, because from a cost point of view, it would often be cheaper or cost comparable for me to cruise the route instead of fly it. An example that I would give is that when I travelled from Barcelona to Miami at the end of October, so towards the end of the season, I was able to take a transatlantic cruise on Valiant Lady, which is one of the Virgin cruise ships. I paid for that cruise, to be honest, not that much more than what it would have cost me to take the flight. And that meant that rather than flying and then having all these days to make up for in Miami, I could fly to Barcelona, have 14 nights on board a beautiful cruise ship, and then arrive in Miami ready for my next ship. It really was a bit of a no-brainer in that sense. Now, thinking about money, the other reason why I tried to minimise flights was that when you travel long-term, you generally speaking will travel with more luggage than what you would have on a 7-night cruise. And the prices of travelling with luggage can often be double what they would be to travel just as you as a hand luggage passenger. Now, that was the case even for some internal flights that I took in the US. And I will tell you, I have searched high and low to find cheap ways to go from Miami to New York. I even tried to find ferries, but unfortunately, in that example, it made more sense to fly and pay for the luggage. So yes, I always tried to minimise flying where I could, but sometimes with the route I planned, it was just simply unavoidable. Now that I'd figured out all of this, and I realised how to keep costs as trim as they possibly could be, it was then time for me to send that email, which was my spreadsheet, over to my travel agent. And from that point, we could then begin the fun, but also the absolute chaos of booking all of these ships. It was such a great feeling for me to take all of the to-be confirmed cruises from the spreadsheet and make them confirmed bookings that then had booking references, and I could begin making online purchases for all of them. It was so exciting. And actually, it was one of the best parts of the whole trip for me, actually being able to say that I went from having a blank spreadsheet through to having this document which had my entire journey and absolutely everything that I could ever need detailed on it. After I then sent that to my travel agent, she came back with, generally speaking, prices that I was happy with, and that meant that the final part of the planning stage could be executed, which was, that's right, making all of the bookings. Still can't believe when I look back on it that I was actually able to do it. But once all the bookings were in the calendar, then all I had to do was look forward to the trip. Now that we've covered how I planned the trip and some of the things that I had to think about, let's now move on to look at a topic which you've probably already picked up is super important to me, and that is costs and some of the things that you can think about to keep them from spiralling out of control. First, whether you're travelling long term or whether you're taking a 7-night cruise, you have to remember that there's far more to the price and the cost of a cruise than just the cruise fare alone. The cruise fare will cover things like the included dining options and the accommodation and a few other bits, but generally speaking, you're not going to get drinks included. You'll have to pay extra for Wi-Fi. You'll usually have to pay extra for service charges or gratuities, which, yes, if you're cruising long term, be prepared for gratuities to hurt, because in some cases, you can be paying $15 a day, which is a lot of money if you're on board for over 200 nights. Yes, not ideal, but there are so many things that you need to think about. Even going back to the topic of drinks, if you plan to have 1 glass of wine per night, even that really builds up. So it's super important that you're clear with yourself. Exactly what is your budget? What are you willing to spend here? Because the worst thing that you can do, I'll tell you now, is plan a trip like this, start a trip like this, get on ship number 1 and think, I can't really afford a glass of wine because this is going to cost me an absolute fortune. Because then all that's going to happen is you are going to be stressed out your head when you should really be on the adventure of a lifetime. Another thing that I found was so expensive was insurance. Most insurers were willing to provide me with an insurance quote for trips that would be up to 45 days in length. Some would go to trips that were 60 days in length, but generally speaking, it was almost impossible for me to find an insurance option that would cover me for a 3-month window, or even worse, the entire year. I would almost get laughed at when I would phone an insurance company because they would just say, no way, you have to go to a specialist provider for this. Now, that meant that for some parts of my trip, I had to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on insurance. And to be honest, the amount I spent in insurance alone for that 10-month window was a 4-figure sum, which really hurt. Because to be honest, when I was planning the route and planning the whole trip, I just didn't think insurance would be a problem. Because when I take a cruise, I usually will pay I don't know, $20 or like £14 to get insurance. It's never been a problem before, but then I've never travelled long term, and it's simply not worth taking the risk of going on a trip like this, potentially falling ill and not having insurance. So yes, first of all, when it comes to costs, think about the fact that there's so much more to think about financially when you cruise than just the cruise fare. Second, think about what type of cabin you're happy to cruise in. The maths on this is super simple. For me, the less money that I pay to a cruise line, that means that I have more money in my pocket. The more money that I have in my pocket, the more cruises that I can go on. You're starting to get the picture, aren't you? So what that means for me is that I am totally happy staying in an interior or an inside cabin. In other words, a room without a window, because it means that I can save, in some cases, an absolute fortune versus booking a room with a window or booking a room with a balcony. It's just simply not worth it for me to upgrade into balcony cabins when I can be saving so much money by staying on the inside. If you've never tried a cruise before, fine, you maybe don't want to plan to cruise long term without a window because you might feel a bit claustrophobic and you might not like it, but I know that I've taken loads of cruises in inside cabins before and it's never been an issue for me. And in fact, I really like them because I can close the door, it's pitch black, and I get the place to myself. So yeah, definitely think about what type of cabin you would be happy in, because believe me, you can save so much money. Third, if you choose to ship hop like I did, you'll very quickly realise that in order to keep costs down, if you're spending time on land between your ships, you need to try and get out of the city, especially if it's one of those cities where there's loads of cruise ships or it's just busy from a tourist point of view. If I give you the example of Barcelona, the city centre of Barcelona was a nightmare to find budget-friendly accommodation without having to explore hostels where I would have goodness knows how many other people in the room with me, because I would hate that. Now, what I found from that city was that if you then figured out where the train line was or figured out where the bus routes were, and you could very quickly and very easily figure out how you could be a 10-minute train out of the city in a much more affordable place. Now, the same would apply for even when I was looking at Long Beach, California. If you stay slightly out or not on the front where you can see the ships, you're going to save a fortune. The same applies to Miami. Anywhere that I went, generally speaking, if you were happy to not stay right in the thick of it on South Beach in Miami, for example, and stay somewhere where you might be a bus or an Uber or a train in, you can save so much money. The final thing to think about if you're trying to keep costs as trim as possible for a trip like this is, could you cruise during off-peak times for that part of the world? And when it gets to peak times, is there any way that you can completely eradicate paying to be on ships? Now, in my case, this worked perfectly because I had a 10-month window available, so there was nothing stopping me saying, I know, let's plan to do the Caribbean during the off-peak months, or let's go to Dubai when it's a bit quieter. So it's way easier if you've got flexibility. But one other thing that I was really fortunate to be able to do was I was coming back to Scotland in July of my travelling year for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, my first nephew was born in July. So that meant that I wanted to be home for that month to be with my friends and family. Now, that meant that I was able to leave the ships in Europe when they were now entering their real peak window, because the schools were finishing for school holidays, which would mean that the ships would suddenly be at 110, 120% capacity every single week. Solo supplements would be way higher because if a cabin could fit 2 or 4 people, they've got a much higher chance of sailing it when all the schools are on holiday. And the ships would also be so much busier. So in my experience, it would be way less pleasant being on board during those peak summer months. And I'd have to pay more for the luxury of doing it. So yeah, think if there's any way during your travels where you could go home to stop paying to be on ships once you've maybe had enough. Or maybe pick somewhere where you could go and just set up camp for a few weeks. Like if you're in Barcelona, head down the coast to one of the amazing seaside towns and just stay there for a bit, because you'll be able to live way cheaper than what you will if you're paying nightly cruise fares. So, we've now covered the planning element of a trip like this. We've covered some of the things that you can think about from a cost point of view. Let's now move on to a topic that I get asked all the time, which is, you had a life on land, you then turned that into a life at sea. What things did you have to think about to make that transition a lot easier? Up first, the first thing that I did with my life here on land to get ready for moving on to ships was that I saved. My lifestyle changed dramatically once I started to book these cruise ships, because I no longer was getting, in some cases, multiple takeaways a week. Yes, I'm ashamed to admit that, but I really cut back on the amount of eating out I was doing. If I was going out with friends, I would more often than not opt to drive and take my car, because that meant that I would only pay for a couple of soft drinks rather than paying for a bar tab full of alcohol for the night. I then would really cut back on other trips that I'd be going on. There were so many things that I would do to try and just aggressively save for this trip, because I knew that when I went on sabbatical, my salary would stop, and I would then enter a world where I would start my travels with that amount of money, and every month it would go down. So I wanted to make sure that that number there was as high as it possibly could be to allow me to enjoy the experience to the full. I'm so glad that I did, because if I hadn't, when I then hit things like a 4-figure insurance bill, that would have really caught me in a situation where I might not have been able to afford it, and I had already booked all the ships. So yes, first thing, I saved, and I saved harder than I ever have before. The second thing that I did with my life on land was that I tried to make myself as cost neutral as I possibly could. Now, what I mean by that was going through all of my bank statements to understand, okay, what money do I have leaving my account here? When does it go out? And is there any way that I can stop that from going out going forward? An example that I would give you was that I made sure that before I started travelling, I had reached the end of the payment agreement that I had set up with the dealership on my car. That therefore meant that every single month I didn't have a payment of X leaving my account, and that was great because it just meant that it was one less thing to worry about. Now, on that note of going through bank statements, it would amaze you how many things you pay for in life that you overlook or you don't even realise you're paying for. Some things like Spotify. Okay, I would like to take Spotify on the ships with me so that I can listen to music on my phone when I'm getting ready to go out, for example. So I would continue to pay for that. But things like Netflix, I need to cancel that because I don't want to be paying for that. Amazon Prime, I'm going to cancel that because I won't have a house that I can get things sent to, so I don't need express delivery on my Amazon account. I would also need to look at things like the high-speed internet that I pay for my house. Don't need that because I won't be here. Utility bills, won't pay that because I won't be here. Now, that then brings us on to the topic of what on earth do you do with your house? Because you can probably tell I'm coming to you now from my house in the middle of England, and it would have been really silly, in my opinion, for me to embark on such an expensive trip and just leave this house empty. Now, what I opted to do in order to continue to push myself down that sort of cost neutral route was I packed everything that I own here at home into a storage container, and it was in storage for the entire time I was travelling. Now, that then gave me the flexibility to put my house here on the rental market, and I was really fortunate that for about 7 months of the 10-month window, I had a tenant in here who would therefore mean that I would then have a rental income. Now, that suddenly meant that further expenses that I had on land, like council tax or my mortgage, they were also then being looked after from the income that would be generated from the property. So it's all about making yourself as cost neutral as you possibly can, or in my case it certainly was. And if there's any little ways that you can actually generate a slight income while you're out on the ships, then that will massively help you as well. I've heard of people in the past who have then launched into digital hobbies while they've been travelling. They've embarked on stock photography and various other things where they've been able to make a couple of pounds or a couple of dollars every few weeks. And that's then been money that they could then spend on an excursion once a month or going out for drinks every couple of weeks while they're travelling. So there's a number of different things that you can do. But I would say that probably is the main things that I did to make that transition way simpler for me. Now, the final thing that I would say is that if you are planning to take a trip like this, and if you are looking at everything I've just said, and you're thinking, I have no idea where to start, please just reach out to me. You can leave me a comment here on YouTube, or you can come over to my website at www.fraseratsea.com, or you can also find me on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/Fraser at Sea. There are a number of ways that you can reach out, and I can try to help to impart some more of my experience of this, because before I did this, I had no idea where to even start. So yes, if there's anything that I can help with, please just let me know. And that brings us to the end of episode 5 of this 7-part series. Can you believe that's episode 5 done? Now, the next episode is where I am going to cover the ports, because I've said multiple times that a cruise is way more than the ship. A cruise is way more than the cabin. A cruise is way more than the onboard experience. And that's because the main reason why I took all these cruises was to see the world. So in my next video, I'm going to share with you my best port, my least favourite port, so on and so forth. I've got so much to tell you about. But I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, then going back to what we said earlier, please think about supporting my channel by clicking the thumbs up button. And also, come with me on loads more ships by clicking subscribe. It's super easy and totally free of charge for you to do. But for now, wherever this video finds you in the world, thank you so much for being here. Have a great day, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video.